My son looked me dead in the eyes inside the most expensive restaurant I had ever entered and said,
Everyone
"Mom,
look at her. This is what poverty looks like.
you're too poor
Son,
to sit
please,
here."
don't do this.
You don't
The
belong
entire
here.
table went silent. I stood there holding my old purse, wearing the only dress I could still afford to mend instead of replace.
It's
His
time.
wife looked away
I have to do
in
this.
embarrassment. One of the investors actually smirked. Then Michael asked the waiter to move me to a small table near the kitchen doors. And that was the moment something inside me finally broke. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and made one call. "Harold," I said quietly, "it's time. Before we continue, if this story touches your heart in any way, please take a moment to like and subscribe." Stories like these remind us how easily people forget the hands that raised them. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged because of your clothes, your money, or where you came from? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always love reading your messages. I live in a small one-story house on the west side of San Antonio, Texas. The paint on the porch rails has started peeling again, and every summer I tell myself I'll repaint them before the heat gets too bad. Somehow I never do. Maybe because some things stop mattering after a while? Or maybe because when you get older, you learn how to live with things unfinished. Most mornings, I wake up before sunrise. I make coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug my husband Carlos bought me 23 years ago at a roadside gift shop outside El Paso. The handle is cracked now, but I still use it anyway. I suppose that says a lot about me. I still hold on to things long after they've started falling apart, especially people. After Carlos died, the house became painfully quiet. At first, I used to leave the television on just to hear another human voice in the room. But eventually, even that started feeling exhausting. So now, I spend most of my days volunteering at St. Matthew's Church pantry watering my tiny garden and pretending I don't notice how rarely my phone rings. My son Michael used to call every Sunday. Then it became once a month, then holidays only. Now, sometimes 6 months pass before I hear his voice. Still, whenever my phone lights up with his name, my heart reacts the same way it did when he was 5 years old and ran into my arms after kindergarten. That never changes for a mother, no matter how old her child becomes. 3 weeks before the dinner, I was folding laundry when my phone rang unexpectedly. Michael. Just seeing his name made me smile. I answered on the second ring. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. Not the warm kind, the distracted kind. "Hey, Mom." I could hear traffic in the background and people talking around him. He sounded busy, important, far away. "You okay?" I asked gently. Yeah. Listen, I wanted to invite you to dinner next Friday." I nearly dropped the towel in my hand. Dinner at a restaurant in Dallas. It's an important night for me. Investors, business partners. Vanessa will be there too. His voice sounded rehearsed, almost rushed, but I barely noticed. Because for the first time in years, my son was inviting me somewhere. My chest tightened with hope. "Oh, Michael, I'd love that." "Good," he replied quickly. "Dress nice, okay?" I laughed softly. "I'll try my best." Another silence. Then he added, "This dinner matters a lot." Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't explain why. Still, I ignored the feeling. Because lonely people become experts at ignoring warning signs. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at the wall with tears in my eyes. Not sad tears. Happy ones. I truly believed my son missed me. That night, I opened the old cedar chest in my closet, where I kept things too precious to throw away. Inside were memories of another life. Carlos's leather wallet, birthday cards Michael made as a child, a tiny baseball glove from Little League, and underneath everything else, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was my navy blue dress. I hadn't worn it in almost 4 years. It wasn't expensive even when I bought it. But Carlos once told me I looked beautiful in it during our 25th anniversary dinner. That was enough reason to keep it forever. I held the dress against myself in the mirror and smiled sadly. Well, I whispered to Carlos's memory, our boy finally invited me somewhere. For the next several days, I prepared for that dinner like it was the most important event of my life. Because maybe it was. I took the dress to a small tailor down the street so she could repair the loose hem. I polished my old shoes myself at the kitchen table. I even skipped buying groceries one afternoon so I could afford to get my hair done at the little salon near the church. The young stylist kept showing me trendy hairstyles on her phone. I just smiled politely. At my age, I told her simple is fine. But the truth was, I wanted to look nice for my son. I wanted him to feel proud walking beside me. That realization hurts now more than I can explain. A few days before the trip, my granddaughter Emma called me. Grandma. Her sweet voice instantly brightened my day. Well, there's my favorite girl. She giggled. Dad said you're coming to Dallas. I am. I'm glad, she whispered. Something in her tone made me pause. Why are you whispering, honey? No reason, but children always know more than adults think they do. You okay? I asked. Another pause. Then she quietly said, Grandma, don't let them make you feel small. My smile faded. What do you mean? But before she could answer, I heard Vanessa's voice in the background. Emma, homework, now. The line disconnected a second later. I stared at my phone uneasily. For the first time since Michael invited me, doubt crept into my chest. Still, I pushed it away. Because mothers survive on hope longer than they survive on logic. The morning of the dinner, I woke up before dawn. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, carefully curling my gray hair the way Carlos always liked it. Then I put on my navy blue dress and my small pearl earrings, the ones Carlos bought me when Michael graduated college. I remember how proud we were that day. Carlos cried harder than I did. Someday, he told me afterward, our son's going to do incredible things. And he was right. Michael did become successful. He became everything we dreamed for him. Everything except kind. Before leaving the house, I looked around my tiny living room one last time. The old couch, the faded curtains, the family photos lining the shelf. Especially the photo of Michael at age 10, smiling with missing front teeth while holding my hand. Back then, he used to tell everyone I was his hero. I touched the frame softly. Then I picked up my purse and headed for Dallas, still believing that somewhere underneath the expensive suits and polished smiles, my little boy was waiting for me. I had no idea that by the end of the night, my heart would break in front of an entire room full of strangers. Dallas always felt too shiny for someone like me, too polished, too expensive, too fast. As my bus pulled into the downtown station that evening, I pressed my fingers nervously against my purse and looked out the window at the glowing skyscrapers reflecting gold in the setting sun. Men in tailored suits hurried across sidewalks, while luxury cars slid silently through traffic like scenes from a movie I could never afford to enter. I suddenly became very aware of my shoes, of the wrinkles in my hands, of the fact that my coat was nearly 10 years old. Still, I kept reminding myself why I was there. Michael invited me. That thought alone carried me through the anxiety twisting in my stomach. I took a taxi to the restaurant. Even saying its name made me nervous because I had practiced the pronunciation 3 times before stepping out of the cab. The entrance looked more like a luxury hotel than a place to eat. Tall glass doors, marble floors, a waterfall wall glowing under soft amber lights. The hostess smiled politely when I walked in, though I noticed her eyes briefly scan my clothes before returning to her computer. "Reservation name?" she asked. "Michael Martinez." Her expression changed instantly. "Oh, of course." That surprised me. She suddenly stood straighter and offered a brighter smile. "They're in the private dining section." As she guided me through the restaurant, I could feel eyes turning toward me from elegant tables filled with wealthy couples sipping wine. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and soft piano music drifted through the room. I felt completely out of place. The hostess stopped in front of a large private dining area separated by glass walls. And there he was. My son. Michael stood near the center of the room, laughing confidently beside a group of wealthy men in dark suits. His expensive watch flashed under the lights as he shook hands with someone I recognized from television business interviews. For a moment, pride filled my chest so suddenly it almost hurt. That's my boy. My little boy. Then Michael saw me, and the expression on his face changed. The smile disappeared instantly. Not because he was emotional, because he was uncomfortable. I saw it immediately. His eyes dropped to my coat, my purse, my shoes. Then he forced a smile and walked toward me. "Mom," he said quietly. I leaned forward to hug him, but he only gave me a quick side embrace. "You made it." "Of course I did," I said warmly. "I wouldn't miss this." His attention flickered nervously toward the table behind him. "Right." I tried to ignore the strange tension in his voice. Then a woman approached us, holding a wine glass. Vanessa. She looked beautiful in a silver designer dress, her dark hair perfectly styled diamonds sparkling around her neck. And somehow, she still managed to look annoyed. "Evelyn," she said with a thin smile. "It's nice to see you," I replied honestly. She kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. "We didn't know if you'd actually come all the way from San Antonio?" Michael laughed awkwardly. "Mom's stubborn." I smiled gently. "That's true." But neither of them laughed with me. Before I could say anything else, a tall man with silver hair approached the group. "Michael," he said confidently, "is this your mother?" Michael hesitated. It lasted only a second. But a mother notices those things. Every time. "Yes," he finally answered. "This is my mom, Evelyn." The man extended his hand warmly. "Richard Coleman, I've heard a lot about you." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I shook his hand politely. "All good things, I hope." Richard chuckled. "Well, Michael said he grew up with very humble beginnings." Vanessa quickly stepped in. "And look how far he's come," she added proudly. I noticed the emphasis immediately. "Not we, not family, him." Michael guided me toward the table. "This dinner is important," he whispered under his breath. "Just relax, okay?" The comment confused me. I am relaxed. Good. The table was enormous, decorated with candles and white roses. Everyone seated there looked wealthy, polished, confident. Women with diamond bracelets. Men discussing investments and resorts. People who probably spent more on one dinner than I spent in 3 months. As I sat down carefully, conversation slowed almost imperceptibly. I could feel them observing me, trying to understand how I fit into Michael's perfect image. One woman smiled politely. "So, Evelyn, what do you do?" I opened my mouth, but Vanessa answered first. She mostly keeps busy with church activities and community volunteering. Mostly. The word stung more than it should have. As if my entire life could be reduced to mostly. "I enjoy helping people," I said softly. "That's sweet," another woman replied with the kind of smile people use when speaking to children. Michael immediately redirected the conversation toward business projections and expansion plans. I sat quietly listening while expensive wine was poured around me. Nobody offered me any. Not at first, and somehow that hurt more than I expected. A waiter eventually approached. "Would you like wine, ma'am?" Before I could answer, Michael cut in. "She's fine with water." I looked at him surprised. "I actually wouldn't mind a little water's good, Mom." His smile never reached his eyes. The waiter nodded awkwardly and walked away. Heat crept into my face. I suddenly felt very small. As dinner continued, I listened to Michael speak with confidence I barely recognized anymore. He talked about luxury developments, high-end partnerships, future acquisitions. Everything sounded expensive. Everything sounded impressive. And yet, every few minutes I caught him glancing nervously at me like he was afraid I might embarrass him. At one point, Richard leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know, Michael, I respect family-oriented people. Not enough successful men keep close relationships with their parents." Michael laughed lightly. "Yeah, family's important to me." The lie landed in my chest like a stone, because deep down, I realized something awful. I wasn't there because Michael missed me. I was there because I made him look good. A prop, a performance. Proof that he was still connected to his roots. Suddenly, Emma appeared beside my chair. "Grandma." Her face brightened the second she saw me. Unlike everyone else in that room, her hug felt real. I held her tightly. "You look beautiful tonight," she whispered. "So do you, sweetheart." Then she quietly added near my ear, "I'm glad you came." I pulled back slightly. There was sadness in her eyes. Fear, even. Before I could ask why, Vanessa called sharply from across the table. "Emma, sit down properly." Emma obeyed immediately. The warmth disappeared from the room again. As the main course arrived, I accidentally overheard two investors speaking quietly near the end of the table. "I thought his mother lived in assisted housing or something." "Yeah, that's what I heard too." My stomach dropped. I slowly turned toward Michael. He avoided my eyes. And in that moment, I realized something even more painful than neglect. My son was ashamed of me. Not because I had failed him, but because I reminded him where he came from. The moment I realized Michael was ashamed of me, something inside my chest began to ache in a way I cannot fully describe. Not sharp, not sudden, just heavy, like grief slowly waking up after years of sleeping quietly beneath the surface. I lowered my eyes to the white tablecloth in front of me and tried to pretend I hadn't heard the investors whispering. Around me, silverware clinked softly against expensive plates, while conversations about money and luxury resorts continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. Because once a mother sees embarrassment in her child's eyes, she can never completely unsee it. A waiter placed a plate in front of me decorated so beautifully it barely looked like food. Tiny slices of steak rested beneath delicate herbs and colorful sauces painted across porcelain. I smiled politely. "Thank you." As I reached for my fork, Vanessa glanced at my hands, then at my purse resting beside my chair, then at Michael. That tiny look between them told me more than words ever could. Vanessa leaned closer to me with a smile that looked sweet from a distance. "You know," she said softly, "this restaurant has a very strict dress code, but I suppose Michael made an exception tonight." The comment hit me like a slap. I forced a small smile. I did my best. "Oh, of course," she replied quickly. "I didn't mean anything by it." But she did. People always do. Across the table, Richard Coleman continued speaking about investment opportunities, while Michael nodded confidently beside him. Watching my son laugh and charm everyone around him felt strange. Because I remembered the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee playing baseball. The boy who once slept beside my bed after Carlos died because he was afraid I would feel lonely. Where had that boy gone? Emma quietly reached for my hand under the table. I squeezed hers gently. She was the only warmth left in the room. Then Richard suddenly looked toward me again. "So, Evelyn," he said kindly, "Michael tells us you sacrificed a lot for him growing up." I opened my mouth to answer, but Michael interrupted almost immediately. "Well, we all struggled back then," he said casually. "But I worked hard to build everything myself. Everything myself." The words pierced deeper than he probably realized. Not because I wanted credit, but because I remembered every sacrifice hidden behind his success. The double shifts cleaning hotel rooms, the nights I skipped dinner so he could have enough food before football practice, the years I wore the same shoes so he could attend a better school district. I remembered selling my wedding necklace to help cover his college housing deposit after Carlos passed away. And now, sitting under crystal chandeliers worth more than my entire house, my son erased all of it with one sentence. I lowered my eyes before anyone could see the pain in them. A few minutes later, one of the waiters approached carrying wine glasses. As he carefully reached across the table, someone bumped his arm slightly from behind. Red wine splashed across the front of my navy blue dress. Gasps filled the table. "Oh my goodness," the waiter stammered. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." "It's all right," I said quickly. "Accidents happen." I grabbed my napkin and tried blotting the stain gently, but Vanessa exhaled dramatically beside me. "Oh no," she muttered. "That's unfortunate." Michael's jaw tightened immediately, not with concern for me, with irritation. The waiter continued apologizing nervously while I tried to reassure him. "Please don't worry," I said kindly. "It's just a dress." Then Michael suddenly snapped. "For God's sake." The entire table fell silent. He stared at me with frustration burning across his face. "Can you please be careful for one night?" Shock spread through my chest. I didn't. "This dinner is important, Mom?" His voice had become cold now, sharp, controlled in the kind of way that's somehow worse than yelling. Everyone around the table avoided eye contact. Vanessa looked embarrassed. Not for me, for him, for the scene. I said I was sorry, I whispered. Michael rubbed his forehead aggressively. "You don't understand how these things look." The room became painfully quiet. I could actually hear the piano music from the main dining hall outside the glass walls. Emma stared at her father in disbelief. "Dad?" But Michael kept going. "You show up underdressed, you spill wine everywhere I didn't spill it," Emma interrupted quietly. Michael ignored her completely. Then he looked directly at me and said the sentence that shattered something between us forever. "Mom, you're too poor to sit here." I stopped breathing for a moment. Not physically, emotionally. The entire world around me seemed to freeze. Even the waiter looked horrified. Vanessa whispered, "Michael." But he was too deep into his own anger now. "You don't belong in rooms like this," he continued under his breath. "These people are important. These people are important." The implication hung heavily in the air. And what was I? A burden. An embarrassment, a mistake from a poor life he wanted erased. I looked around the table. Nobody defended me. Nobody. Richard Coleman looked deeply uncomfortable, but even he stayed silent. The investors stared down at their plates. Vanessa avoided my eyes. Only Emma looked heartbroken. Then Michael turned toward the waiter. "Can you move her to another table?" The waiter blinked in confusion. "Sir, somewhere quieter." His expression hardened further. Near the back, near the back. Like I was something that needed hiding. Humiliation burned through every inch of me, but strangely, I still didn't cry. Not yet. The waiter looked at me apologetically. "You don't have to move, ma'am." But I slowly stood anyway. My knees felt weak beneath me. "It's all right," I said softly. I picked up my purse carefully, and as I did, I caught sight of Emma crying silently beside her plate. That nearly broke me more than Michael's words, because children should never have to witness cruelty from their own parents. As I followed the waiter away from the private dining table, I heard low whispers begin immediately behind me. The rich always whisper when they're uncomfortable. The small table near the kitchen sat beside swinging service doors, where waiters rushed in and out carrying trays of food. The smell of garlic and smoke filled the cramped corner. It was loud, hot, hidden. Perfect for someone Michael didn't want seen. I sat down slowly. For a few seconds, I simply stared at my hands resting in my lap. These hands had held my son through fevers, packed his school lunches, worked until the skin cracked open from bleach and chemicals, and tonight, those same hands trembled slightly from humiliation. A tear finally escaped down my cheek. I wiped it away immediately. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't used in almost 2 years. The line rang once, then a calm, older voice answered. "Harold Whitman speaking." I closed my eyes briefly. When I spoke, my voice came out far steadier than I felt. "Harold," I said quietly. "It's time." Silence. Then his tone changed instantly. "What happened?" I looked across the restaurant toward the private dining room where my son sat pretending I no longer existed. And for the first time that night, my heartbreak began turning into something else. Something colder. Something stronger. "I'm ready now," I whispered. Harold did not ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the reasons Carlos trusted him for so many years. After my husband died, Harold Whitman became the only person in the world who knew every secret Carlos left behind. He handled legal documents, investments, contracts, and promises I had spent decades protecting. Promises even my own son knew nothing about. I held the phone tightly against my ear while the noise from the kitchen doors crashed around me. "What happened?" Harold repeated, his voice lower now. I looked across the restaurant toward the private dining room. Through the glass walls, I could still see Michael laughing nervously with his investors, pretending the scene from moments ago had never happened. As if humiliating his mother was just another inconvenience to clean up before dessert. I swallowed hard. "He finally showed me who he became," I whispered. Harold went silent for a moment. Then he sighed softly. "I was afraid this day would come." A tear slipped down my cheek again, but my voice remained steady. "So was I." "Are you certain?" he asked carefully. That question mattered, because once certain things were set into motion, they could not easily be undone. I closed my eyes briefly. Images flooded my mind. Michael at age 7 running into my arms after school. Michael crying at Carlos's funeral. Michael promising me he would take care of Mom forever. And then tonight. "Mom, you're too poor to sit here." The words replayed in my chest like broken glass. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm certain." Harold's tone shifted instantly into professional calm. "All right, give me 20 minutes. Then he hung up. I slowly lowered the phone and stared at the black screen in my trembling hands. For the first time all evening, I noticed how exhausted I felt. Not physically, emotionally, like I had spent years carrying love for someone who no longer knew how to carry it back. A young waitress approached my small table nervously. "Ma'am," she asked softly. I looked up. "I'm very sorry about earlier." Her kindness nearly made me cry again. "It wasn't your fault," I said gently. She hesitated before placing a fresh napkin beside me. "I just wanted to say—" She lowered her voice. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that." I smiled weakly. "Thank you." Before leaving, she glanced toward the private dining room and frowned slightly. "I think your granddaughter is trying to come over here." I turned just in time to see Emma slipping away from the table, but Vanessa grabbed her wrist before she could leave. Emma looked toward me helplessly. Vanessa whispered something sharply into her ear before forcing a smile for the investors. Emma slowly sat back down, though her eyes remained fixed on me the entire time. That hurt more than anything else, because children remember moments like this forever. I looked away before she could see the tears building again. A few minutes later, Michael finally approached my table. His expression was tense and irritated. Not guilty, not ashamed, annoyed. "Mom," he said under his breath, "what are you doing?" I blinked at him in confusion. "I'm sitting where you told them to put me." He glanced around nervously. "Can you not make this worse?" A bitter ache spread through my chest. "Make this worse." I looked down at the wine stains spreading across my dress, then back at my son. I didn't realize humiliation could be graded in levels. His jaw tightened. "You know what I mean." "No," I replied softly. "I don't think I do." Michael exhaled aggressively and lowered his voice further. "These people are considering a major partnership with me. Tonight matters, and I don't." The question escaped before I could stop it. For one brief second, something flickered across his face. Guilt. But it vanished almost immediately. "Mom, please don't do this right now. Do this." As if pain was an inconvenience, as if heartbreak was bad timing. I studied my son carefully under the dim restaurant lights and suddenly realized something terrifying. He genuinely believed he was the victim tonight. Not me. Him. Because narcissism has a strange way of rewriting reality. "You embarrassed me," he whispered harshly. I stared at him in disbelief. Then before I could answer, movement near the front entrance caught everyone's attention. A tall woman in a black tailored suit entered the restaurant with purposeful steps. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek bun, and every employee she passed immediately straightened their posture. Sophia Reed. Even from a distance, I recognized her instantly. She was the regional operations director for the restaurant group. Michael noticed her too. His expression brightened immediately. "Good," he muttered. "Maybe she can smooth this over." Smooth this over, as if the problem was public relations instead of cruelty. Sophia spoke briefly with the hostess near the entrance. Then one of the managers hurried toward her looking pale and anxious. A moment later, the manager pointed directly toward me. Sophia's eyes followed. And the second she recognized my face, her expression changed completely. Shock. Then panic. She immediately began walking toward my small table. Michael frowned beside me. "You know her?" Before I could answer, Sophia arrived, and to Michael's visible confusion, she looked directly at me, not him. "Mrs. Martinez?" she said carefully. "I am so sorry." Michael blinked. "What's going on?" Sophia ignored him completely for several seconds. That alone stunned him. "I didn't know you were here tonight," she continued apologetically. "If I had known—" "It's all right," I interrupted softly, but Sophia looked horrified. "No, ma'am, it absolutely is not all right." The nearby staff members froze. Even the waiters suddenly looked nervous. Michael straightened awkwardly. "Sophia, this is my mother." "I know exactly who she is," Sophia replied immediately. Something in her tone made Michael's confidence falter. Richard Coleman and several investors were now openly watching from the private dining room. Vanessa looked confused. Emma looked hopeful. Michael forced a laugh. "Well, obviously," he gestured toward me impatiently. "There was just a misunderstanding tonight." Sophia's expression hardened slightly. A misunderstanding? Nobody spoke. The air itself suddenly felt heavy. Then Sophia looked at the wine stain on my dress, the isolated table near the kitchen, my untouched dinner plate, and finally the tears I had clearly failed to hide completely. When she looked back at Michael, her face had changed. Not professionally, personally, disappointed. "What exactly happened here?" she asked quietly. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing serious." I almost pitied him then, because for the first time all evening, I saw uncertainty enter his eyes, the kind of uncertainty wealthy people feel when power begins quietly moving away from them. Sophia turned toward the restaurant manager. "Clear the private room," she said firmly. Michael frowned immediately. "What?" The manager hesitated. "But sir's investors are still, I heard you," Sophia replied sharply. The manager nodded nervously and rushed away. Michael stared at her in disbelief. "You can't just interrupt my dinner?" Sophia finally looked directly at him, and her next words changed the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. "Yes," she said calmly. "I can." The silence after Sophia's words felt almost violent. "Yes," she said calmly. "I can." Michael stared at her as if he genuinely believed he had heard wrong. Around us, conversations throughout the restaurant had slowed noticeably. Wealthy diners pretended not to watch while absolutely watching. That's what rich people do. They avoid scenes publicly while feeding on them privately. Michael forced a stiff laugh. "Sophia, I think there's been some confusion." "No," she replied evenly. "I don't believe there has." For the first time that evening, I saw real uncertainty enter my son's face. Not embarrassment, fear. Sophia turned toward me again. "Mrs. Martinez, would you prefer somewhere more comfortable?" The kindness in her voice contrasted so sharply with Michael's cruelty that my chest tightened painfully. "I'm all right here," I said softly. But she shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am, you are not." The manager hurried forward nervously. "Should we prepare the executive room?" "Executive room." The words visibly confused several investors nearby. Michael blinked rapidly. "What executive room?" Sophia ignored him again. "Yes," she told the manager. "Immediately." As staff members rushed away, Michael stepped closer to her. "Sophia," he whispered harshly. "What exactly is going on?" She finally looked at him directly, and there was no warmth in her eyes anymore. "I think," she said carefully, "that's a question you should be asking your mother." Michael turned slowly toward me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not Vanessa. Not Richard Coleman. Not even Emma. The entire room seemed suspended in tension, and suddenly, against my will, memories began flooding back. Not of tonight, of years ago, of the life Michael had worked so hard to erase. Back when he was little, we lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in San Antonio. The walls shook every time the industrial machines downstairs started spinning. Summers were unbearable because the air conditioner barely worked, and during winter, we used the oven for heat more times than I care to admit. But Michael used to laugh constantly back then. He didn't care about money. He cared about baseball cards, cartoons, and whether I tucked him in before bed. Carlos worked construction during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. Sometimes he came home so exhausted, he fell asleep sitting at the kitchen table with his boots still on. But no matter how tired he was, he always kissed my forehead first. Always. Then, one rainy October afternoon, everything changed. Carlos collapsed at work. Heart attack. 47 years old. Gone before I even reached the hospital. I still remember Michael screaming when I told him. The sound never truly leaves you as a mother. After the funeral, life became survival. I cleaned motel rooms during the day, worked at a diner some nights, cared for elderly patients on weekends. I barely slept for almost 6 years. There were nights my hands bled from cleaning chemicals, but I still packed Michael's school lunch before sunrise because I refused to let him feel different from the other kids. I wanted him to dream bigger than poverty, and he did. Maybe too big. Michael earned scholarships, graduated college, entered the hospitality business, built connections, learned how wealthy people spoke, dressed, and carried themselves. At first, I was proud. Then slowly, something changed. He stopped bringing friends home, stopped mentioning where he came from, stopped introducing me at company events unless absolutely necessary. The first time he looked embarrassed by me, he was 28 years old. I still remember it clearly. He had just started dating Vanessa. They visited my house for dinner, and I accidentally spoke Spanish to an elderly neighbor while taking out the trash. Later that night, Michael quietly told me, "Mom, maybe don't do that around Vanessa's family." I laughed at first because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Why, I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "They're just different." Different. Such a harmless-looking word, yet capable of carrying so much shame inside it. That was the beginning. After that, Michael became increasingly careful about how I fit into his world. He bought me nicer clothes once, not out of generosity, but because he said my wardrobe made me look older than necessary. He tried convincing me to move into a retirement community farther away from downtown. Not because it was safer. Because he didn't want clients unexpectedly seeing where I lived. At first, I kept making excuses for him. Stress, pressure, success changing people. But deep down, I knew the truth. Michael hated poverty so much that eventually he began hating every reminder of it, including me. And still, I loved him anyway. Because mothers are strange creatures. We keep watering dead gardens hoping something blooms again. Mrs. Martinez, Sophia's voice, pulled me back to the present. I blinked quickly. "Yes, the room is ready." I nodded slowly and stood from the small kitchen table. This time, however, the entire restaurant staff moved differently around me. Waiters stepped aside respectfully. Managers straightened nervously. Even the hostess from earlier looked pale now. Michael noticed all of it. "What the hell is this?" he asked under his breath. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. "You told me your mother was barely getting by." The accusation in her voice made Michael snap defensively. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she said calmly. "She isn't." Richard Coleman stood from the private dining table now, curiosity overcoming politeness. "All right," he said carefully. "I think someone should explain what's happening." Sophia looked toward me first, silently asking permission. I hesitated. Not because I feared the truth. Because once truth enters a room, relationships rarely survive unchanged. Still, I gave a small nod. Sophia turned back toward Richard. "Mrs. Evelyn Martinez," she said professionally, "is the majority controlling shareholder of the Marquez Hospitality Group." Complete silence. One investor actually laughed in disbelief. What Michael stared at her blankly. "No," he said immediately. "That's impossible." But nobody was looking at him anymore. They were looking at me. Richard blinked several times. "The Marquez Group owns this restaurant." "Yes," Sophia replied. Vanessa's face had completely lost color. Michael shook his head slowly. No, that's not possible." I almost pitied him then. because for the first time in his adult life, my son realized something devastating. He had never truly known who his mother was. Sophia continued carefully. Mrs. Martinez has held controlling interests through family trust structures for many years. Michael turned toward me stunned. You own this place. His voice sounded smaller now, younger somehow. I held his gaze quietly. I own much more than this place. The words hit him like a physical blow. Emma stared at me with wide eyes full of confusion and admiration. Grandma. I smiled sadly at her. Richard Coleman slowly loosened his tie. Well, he muttered softly, this dinner just became very interesting. But Michael wasn't listening anymore, because the foundation beneath his entire identity had just started cracking apart. And deep down, I think he already knew something worse was still coming. The entire restaurant seemed to shift around me after Sophia revealed the truth. Not loudly, quietly, like gravity itself had changed direction. A few minutes earlier, I had been the poor old woman hidden beside the kitchen. Now waiters stood straighter when they looked at me. Managers whispered nervously into headsets. Investors who barely acknowledged my existence suddenly couldn't stop staring. Money changes how people hear your voice, even when the voice itself never changed. Michael looked pale. Not embarrassed anymore, shaken. You're lying, he said to Sophia, though his voice lacked conviction. There's no way my mother owns controlling shares in Marquez Hospitality. Sophia remained calm. I assure you, Mr. Martinez, I would never joke about corporate ownership structures. Vanessa slowly turned toward me. All traces of superiority had vanished from her face now. In their place was confusion and fear. You never told us any of this, she whispered. I met her gaze, quietly. You never asked. That silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Richard Coleman stepped closer, his businessman instincts now fully awake. Mrs. Martinez, he said carefully, forgive me, but if this is true, why live the way you do? I almost smiled at that. Because wealthy people always ask the same question. Why not spend it as if money only exists to be displayed? I folded my hands calmly in front of me, because I know what it feels like not to have any. Nobody spoke. Even Michael looked stunned by the answer. The truth was simple. After growing up with almost nothing, wealth never impressed me the way it impressed other people. Expensive things made Michael feel powerful, but they never made me feel safe. Only love ever did that. And unfortunately, love was the one thing money couldn't buy back, once lost. Sophia gestured toward the executive dining room nearby. Mrs. Martinez, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. Michael immediately stepped forward. Yes, he said quickly. Good idea. But Sophia stopped him with a single glance. You weren't invited. The words landed like a slap. Several investors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Vanessa inhaled sharply, and for the first time in years, I saw my son speechless. Emma quietly moved closer to me. Grandma, she whispered, are you okay? I touched her cheek gently. I will be. Unlike the adults in the room, Emma's concern carried no agenda. That alone nearly broke my heart. As Sophia guided me toward the executive room, I heard Richard stop Michael behind us. Hold on, Richard said firmly. I think I deserve an explanation. Michael lowered his voice aggressively. This is a family matter. No, Richard replied. This became a business matter the moment ownership entered the conversation. I didn't turn around, but I heard the panic beginning underneath Michael's controlled tone. And deep down, I realized something painful. My son wasn't afraid of hurting me. He was afraid of losing status. Inside the executive dining room, Everything looked different from the rest of the restaurant. The lighting was softer, the chairs richer. Private wine cabinets lined the walls. A long, polished table sat beneath a modern chandelier that probably cost more than my first apartment. Sophia personally pulled out a chair for me. The gesture embarrassed me slightly. "You don't need to do that," I said. "Yes," she replied gently. "I do." Once the door closed behind us, the noise from the restaurant faded away. For the first time all night, there was quiet. Real quiet. Sophia sat across from me carefully. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything. I should have known sooner." Her voice carried genuine guilt. I shook my head softly. "How could you?" Still, she looked upset. "When Mr. Whitman called, I came as quickly as I could. At the mention of Harold, I nodded slowly. He's probably on his way." Sophia hesitated before speaking again. "I never imagined Michael would treat you like that." "Neither did I. At least, not openly." I stared down at my wine-stained dress and smoothed the fabric gently with my fingers. "He's been ashamed of me for a long time," I admitted quietly. Saying it out loud hurt more than I expected. Sophia looked saddened. But why, I almost laughed, because the answer was both complicated and painfully simple. "Michael spent his entire life trying to escape poverty," I said. "Eventually, he started treating anything connected to it like an enemy, including me." Sophia lowered her eyes briefly. "My father was like that too after he became successful." I looked up. She smiled sadly. He changed his accent, changed the way he dressed, even stopped speaking to certain relatives. She paused. "Sometimes people think success means erasing where they came from." Her words settled heavily between us. Because she understood. Outside the glass wall, I could still see movement in the restaurant. Michael pacing. Vanessa arguing quietly with him. Richard speaking with other investors. Everything looked unstable now, like a perfect painting beginning to crack down the center. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The door opened, and Harold Whitman walked inside. Even at 72 years old, Harold carried himself with sharp dignity. Gray suit, perfect posture, calm eyes that missed nothing. The second he saw the stain on my dress, his expression darkened. "He did this?" I looked away slightly. Harold sighed deeply. "I warned Carlos this might happen someday." Hearing my husband's name made my chest tighten instantly. Harold approached and gently kissed my forehead. "You all right now?" I answered honestly. That seemed to pain him. Harold had known Michael since birth. He attended birthday parties, graduations, holidays. He loved my son too once. But tonight had changed something for him as well. He placed a thick leather folder carefully onto the table. Sophia looked toward it knowingly. And suddenly, my stomach twisted with anxiety. Because now, things were becoming real. Permanent. Harold sat beside me quietly. "You still have time to walk away from this," he said softly. I knew what he meant. I could leave tonight, pretend none of this happened, continue protecting Michael from consequences like I always had. That's what mothers do sometimes. We confuse protection with love. But then I remembered his face when he said those words. "You're too poor to sit here." Not angry, ashamed, as if I disgusted him. And suddenly, something inside me settled. "No," I whispered. Harold studied me carefully, then slowly nodded. "All right." He opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, financial statements, ownership structures, trust agreements. The hidden foundation beneath Michael's entire empire. And he still had no idea how much of his life had been quietly built by the woman he humiliated tonight. Sophia looked toward the door. "They're asking to come in." Of course they were. The rich always want answers once money becomes involved. Harold calmly adjusted his glasses. Then I suppose he said quietly, "It's time your son finally learns the truth." And somehow, hearing those words frightened me almost as much as it frightened Michael. Because no matter what happened next, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. The knock on the executive room door sounded strangely formal, like the beginning of a courtroom hearing instead of a family conversation. Sophia glanced toward me one last time. "Are you ready?" "No, not even close." But I nodded anyway, because some truths become too heavy to carry forever. Sophia opened the door. Michael entered first. His expensive suit still looked perfect, but the confidence inside it had begun collapsing. Vanessa followed closely behind him, arms folded tightly across her chest. Richard Coleman came next, along with two senior investors whose expressions had shifted from amusement to concern. Emma slipped quietly into the room last. She walked directly to my side without hesitation. That nearly made me cry. Nobody spoke at first. Harold calmly closed the leather folder in front of him and removed his glasses. Michael looked between all of us impatiently. "Can someone finally explain what's happening?" His tone carried irritation, not remorse. Even now. Harold answered before anyone else could. "What's happening," he said calmly, "is that you are learning something your father intended you to understand only when the time was right." Michael frowned. "What does Dad have to do with this?" At the mention of Carlos, the room seemed to quiet even further, because despite all his success, Michael still carried one deep wound beneath everything else: losing his father. Harold folded his hands carefully. Before Carlos Martinez died, he created several investment structures designed to protect his family long-term. Michael scoffed lightly. "My father was a construction worker." "No," Harold corrected gently. "Your father was a very intelligent man who happened to work construction." The distinction mattered. I saw Richard glance toward Michael subtly. Wealthy people respect intelligence. Even hidden intelligence. Harold opened the folder again and slid several documents across the polished table. "These are copies of the original partnership agreements your father entered into 24 years ago." Michael barely looked at them. What partnership agreements? I closed my eyes briefly as memories returned. Carlos sitting at our tiny kitchen table late at night surrounded by papers, numbers, calculators, business plans. Back then, one of Carlos's closest friends had been a chef named Alejandro Marquez. Alejandro dreamed of opening a small family restaurant, but couldn't secure financing because nobody believed a working-class Hispanic man from South Texas could build a successful hospitality brand. Except Carlos believed it. Completely. So he invested nearly everything we had saved. At the time, I thought he was crazy. We barely had enough money ourselves. But Carlos kept saying the same thing. People underestimate quiet men too often. After Carlos died, Alejandro continued building the business slowly. One restaurant became 3. 3 became 10. Then hotels, luxury partnerships, corporate acquisitions. Eventually, the Marquez Hospitality Group became one of the fastest-growing hospitality companies in the Southwest. And through every expansion, our ownership remained protected. Quietly, privately. Harold tapped one document carefully. "Your father retained controlling family shares before his death." Michael stared blankly. "That's impossible. It isn't." Vanessa finally spoke. "So, Evelyn inherited all of this?" Harold nodded. "Yes." The room went silent again. Michael laughed once under his breath. A nervous sound. "No," he muttered. "No, that doesn't make sense. If my mother had all this money, why live like—" He stopped himself too late. "Like what?" Poor, embarrassing human. I answered softly before anyone else could. Because your father and I knew what hunger felt like. Michael looked at me helplessly. You could have lived anywhere. Done anything. I already had everything I wanted. The words escaped quietly, but they landed heavily, because once upon a time, my family truly had been enough for me. Harold slid another set of documents across the table. These, he said calmly, concerned the Martinez family trust. Richard leaned forward with sudden interest. The trust financed Michael's first hotel acquisition, Harold continued. Michael froze completely. What? Harold adjusted his glasses. The startup capital for your hospitality expansion came through layered investment channels managed under your mother's authorization. Michael stared at him. No, I built my company myself. His voice sounded smaller now, more fragile. Harold remained composed. You built it using opportunities your mother quietly protected for you. The words hit harder than anger ever could. I watched my son's face carefully as realization began slowly tearing through his identity, piece by piece, because Michael's entire public image depended on one story: the self-made success, the poor boy who rose alone, the businessman who needed nobody. And now that story was cracking apart in front of investors, his wife, his daughter, everyone. Richard leaned back slowly. So the capital came from family money. Protected family money, Harold clarified. Michael looked at me with betrayal in his eyes. Betrayal? As if I had deceived him. You lied to me? The accusation stunned me. I protected you. That's not the same thing. His voice echoed sharply through the room. Emma flinched beside me. I stared at my son in disbelief. Protected me from what he demanded. From becoming obsessed with money. The room fell silent again. Because deep down, everyone knew I had failed. Michael laughed bitterly. Well, that worked out great. Harold's tone hardened slightly for the first time. Your mother spent years making sure you succeeded on your own merits. I did succeed. Yes, Harold replied calmly, but not alone. Vanessa slowly lowered herself into a chair. You told everyone you grew up with nothing. I did grow up with nothing. Michael snapped defensively. I looked at him sadly. No, I whispered. You grew up with parents who sacrificed everything so you would never feel poor. His eyes flickered toward mine. For one brief second, guilt appeared. Then pride crushed it again. Richard spoke carefully now. So Evelyn controls the trust? Yes, Harold answered. And the restaurant group? Yes. Richard loosened his tie slowly. My God. Michael suddenly stood from his chair and began pacing. This is insane. No one interrupted him. I worked for years, he continued angrily. Years. You let me believe I earned all of this myself. You did earn it, I said softly, but you forgot who carried you when you couldn't walk alone yet? He stopped pacing, and for the first time all evening pain crossed his face instead of arrogance. Real pain. I was ashamed my whole childhood, he admitted quietly. Do you know what it's like watching rich kids laugh at your clothes, your house, your accent? My chest tightened, because suddenly I saw it. Not the cruel businessman, the wounded little boy underneath him. I wanted more for you, I whispered. You made me feel weak. No, I replied sadly. The world did that. I only loved you through it. Tears filled Emma's eyes beside me. Even Vanessa looked shaken now, but Michael's expression hardened once more. Then he asked the question that changed everything. How much control does Mom actually have over my company? Nobody answered immediately. Harold slowly closed the folder. Then he looked directly at Michael. Enough, he said carefully, to take it away. And suddenly, the room no longer felt like a family dinner at all. It felt like the beginning of a war. The room changed after Harold said those words. Enough to take it away. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for the untouched wine sitting on the table anymore. The atmosphere had become too heavy for luxury. Michael stood frozen near the far end of the room, one hand pressed against his hip, while the other dragged anxiously through his hair. For the first time in years, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a frightened child trying to understand why the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Vanessa was the first to speak. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked carefully. Harold remained calm. "It means Mrs. Martinez maintains majority authority over several holding structures directly connected to Michael's hospitality expansion." Richard Coleman leaned forward slowly. "And you never disclosed this?" The question wasn't directed at me. It was directed at Michael. My son swallowed hard. "I didn't know." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "But you represented yourself as fully self-financed." "I believed I was." The investors exchanged uneasy glances. In business, perception matters almost as much as truth, sometimes more. And tonight, Michael's carefully crafted image was collapsing piece by piece. One of the investors, a gray-haired man named Preston Hale, finally spoke. "So let me understand this correctly." He looked toward Harold. "The startup funding came through family trust channels controlled by Evelyn Martinez, yes, and Michael had no idea that is correct." Preston slowly leaned back in his chair. "That's problematic." The word landed heavily. Michael noticed it immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard answered this time. "It means investors don't like surprises." "I didn't lie." Vanessa suddenly laughed once. Not kindly, not warmly, bitterly. "You absolutely lied." Everyone turned toward her. For years, Vanessa had protected Michael publicly, defended him, admired him, built her own social status around his success. But tonight, something inside her had cracked too. "You told everyone you built your empire from scratch," she continued coldly. "You turned your childhood into some inspirational business story." Michael's jaw tightened. "Because it was hard." "No one said it wasn't hard," she snapped. "But that's not the same as being completely self-made." Emma sat silently beside me, clutching my hand tighter. I could feel her trembling slightly. Children always suffer when adults turn love into power struggles. And suddenly, I hated every second of this. Not because Michael didn't deserve consequences, because somewhere beneath all this ugliness was still my son. The little boy who once kissed my cheeks before school. The teenager who cried after his first heartbreak. The young man who promised his dying father he would take care of me. Where had that person gone? Michael turned toward me suddenly. "You knew this would humiliate me." His voice carried accusation now. I stared at him in disbelief. "Humiliate you?" "Yes." He gestured angrily around the room. "You waited until I was in front of investors to expose all this." The unfairness of those words stunned me silent for a moment. Then Harold spoke before I could. "No," he said sharply. "Your mother came here tonight believing her son wanted to reconnect with her." Michael looked away. "Because he knew it was true," Harold continued. "She did not create the situation." "You did." Silence. Painful silence. Then Richard cleared his throat carefully. "There's another issue here." Everyone looked toward him. His expression had grown more serious now. "Michael," he said slowly, "you repeatedly described yourself to our board as financially independent from family influence." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Because I thought I was." That may not matter legally, Richard replied, but professionally it matters. I watched panic begin spreading quietly across my son's face. Not guilt, still panic. Because Michael understood something terrifying now. His reputation, the thing he valued above almost everything else, was beginning to fracture. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. What else don't I know? Michael looked exhausted suddenly. Vanessa, no. Her voice cracked. You made your mother sound like some dependent old woman. I lowered my eyes immediately, because hearing those words spoken aloud hurt more than I expected. Vanessa's face twisted with anger. You told people she struggled financially because she couldn't manage money. Michael said nothing. That silence answered everything. Richard stared at him carefully now. Was any of that true? Michael finally exploded. Why does everyone suddenly care about my mother so much? The room froze. Because sometimes the truth escapes during anger. And what escaped from Michael was ugly. I worked for everything I have, he continued harshly. Nobody handed me success. I stood slowly from my chair. The movement quieted the room instantly. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained calm. No, I said softly. Nobody handed it to you. Michael looked at me with frustration burning in his eyes. You don't understand how hard I fought to get here. I smiled sadly. Oh, Michael. My chest tightened painfully. Every scar on your hands came from climbing upward. I paused. But every scar on mine came from holding the ladder steady while you climbed. The room fell completely silent. Emma started crying quietly beside me. Even Richard looked uncomfortable now, because the difference between sacrifice and ambition had suddenly become painfully visible. Michael looked away first. That told me everything. Sophia, who had remained mostly silent until now, finally stepped forward. There's another matter that needs discussing. Harold glanced toward her knowingly. Michael looked irritated again. What now? Sophia folded her hands carefully. Several expense reports tied to your executive accounts have recently raised concerns. Michael froze. Just slightly. But I noticed. So did Harold. What concerns Richard? Asked sharply. Sophia hesitated before answering. Luxury expenditures categorized under hospitality development. Michael immediately shook his head. That's standard business practice. Private jet vacations, Sophia asked calmly. Michael's face hardened. Networking trips, designer purchases charged through vendor entertainment budgets. Vanessa turned slowly toward him. What Michael looked cornered now. Everyone does it. Richard's expression darkened considerably. No, he said coldly. Not everyone does. The room's atmosphere shifted again. This time from family conflict to business danger. Harold slowly reopened the leather folder. Inside were additional documents I hadn't even reviewed myself yet. My stomach tightened, because suddenly I realized how much Harold had been quietly monitoring behind the scenes. Michael noticed the folder too, and for the first time all night, real fear entered his eyes. What's in there? He asked quietly. Harold adjusted his glasses. Information. Michael stepped forward aggressively. What information? Harold didn't flinch. The kind that becomes very important when someone confuses company money with personal image maintenance. Vanessa stared at her husband. Michael. But he wouldn't look at her now. His breathing had changed. Shorter, faster. Because deep down, he already knew what was coming next. And so did I. The worst part wasn't discovering my son had become arrogant. It wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the cruelty. It was realizing how long he had been building a life entirely dependent on appearances, and how terrified he was of anyone seeing the truth underneath them. Then Harold calmly closed the folder again, and with one sentence, he pushed the night into even darker territory. There are provisions in the trust, he said quietly, specifically created for situations like this. Michael looked up slowly. What situations? Harold held his gaze. When character becomes a liability. When character becomes a liability. Harold's words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Michael stared at him in disbelief. What the hell does that mean? Harold remained perfectly calm, which somehow made everything feel even worse. It means your father understood something long before you became successful. Michael crossed his arms defensively. And what's that? That money reveals people, Harold answered quietly. It doesn't change them. It reveals them. Nobody spoke after that. Not Vanessa, not Richard, not even Emma. Because deep down, everyone in that room was now asking the same question. Who had Michael really become? Harold slowly reopened the leather folder and removed a thin stack of documents clipped neatly together. The Martinez family trust contains behavioral protection clauses. Michael laughed sharply. You're kidding. No. Harold slid the papers across the table toward him. Your father insisted on them personally. Michael didn't touch the documents. This is ridiculous. Actually, Richard muttered quietly, it's extremely smart. Michael ignored him. Harold adjusted his glasses before continuing. The trust states that if the primary beneficiary engages in financial misconduct, abuse of company resources, or conduct deemed harmful to the family's integrity, controlling authority may legally revert to the trust holder. Michael stared blankly, then slowly looked toward me. The trust holder is Mom. Yes, Harold replied. My stomach tightened. Even though I already knew these clauses existed, hearing them spoken aloud still felt surreal. Because Carlos never created them out of distrust. He created them out of fear. Fear that success might someday consume our son. And now, here we were. Michael finally grabbed the papers aggressively and scanned the first page. This is insane, he muttered. No, Harold corrected. This is legal. Vanessa leaned closer. Financial misconduct. Her voice sounded smaller now. Careful. Michael instantly shook his head. There is no misconduct. Sophia stepped forward quietly. That depends on how the board interprets several expenditures currently under review. Michael glared at her. You've been auditing me. No, Sophia replied calmly. The accounting department flagged irregularities. Richard's expression darkened immediately. What irregularities? Michael rubbed his face with frustration. Oh my God, this is being blown completely out of proportion. Harold calmly removed another file from the folder. Private resort expenses billed under hospitality outreach. Michael looked away instantly. Client relations? Luxury vehicle leases through operational subsidiaries. Brand representation. Personal vacations categorized as executive development. Michael's silence answered everything. Vanessa stared at him. You used company money for vacations? It wasn't illegal. That wasn't my question. Her voice cracked slightly. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine hurt in her eyes too. Not because of the money, because of the lies. Michael slammed the documents onto the table. Everyone in business does this. Richard stood abruptly. No, he snapped. Careful, people don't. The room fell silent again. I watched my son carefully. His breathing had become shallow, aggressive, desperate. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. Michael still didn't truly understand why tonight mattered. He thought this was about money, about control, about embarrassment, but it wasn't. It was about dignity. Mine. And maybe somewhere beneath everything. His too. Emma quietly moved closer beside me. "Grandma," she whispered, "are they taking Dad to jail?" The innocence in her voice nearly shattered me. I touched her hand gently. "No, sweetheart. At least I hope not." Michael suddenly looked toward me with anger burning behind his eyes. "You're really going to do this?" The accusation hurt. Not because he was angry, because even now he refused to see his own role in what happened. I stared at him quietly. "You humiliated me tonight. So now you're trying to destroy my life?" "No." My voice trembled slightly for the first time. "You destroyed something yourself tonight, Michael." For a brief moment, emotion flickered across his face again, but pride swallowed it almost instantly. He looked toward Harold. "So what now? Mom takes my company." "No," Harold replied calmly. "The company was never fully yours to begin with." Those words hit harder than anything else that night. Michael physically recoiled slightly. Because for a man whose entire identity centered around achievement ownership mattered more than love. Vanessa suddenly stood from her chair. "I need a minute." Without waiting for anyone to answer, she walked quickly toward the door. Emma looked torn, watching her mother leave. "Go with her?" I whispered gently, but Emma shook her head. "No." Then quietly, "I want to stay with you." The words broke something inside me, because children always move toward the person who feels safest. And tonight, that wasn't Michael anymore. Richard loosened his tie again and looked toward Harold. "If these clauses activate what happens operationally," Michael turned sharply. "You can't seriously be entertaining this?" Richard ignored him. Harold answered professionally. "Temporary suspension of executive authority pending board review." Michael stared at him. "That's insane." "Actually," Sophia replied quietly, "given the financial concerns, it's probably inevitable." I saw it happen then. The exact moment panic fully replaced arrogance inside my son. His face lost all color. "You can't do this to me." Harold folded his hands. "Michael, nobody wanted this." "You think I wanted this?" His voice rose sharply now. The polished businessman mask was finally cracking apart completely. I spent my entire life trying not to end up powerless like we were growing up. The room froze, because pain had finally entered his anger. Real pain. He pointed toward me emotionally. "You think being poor was noble? It wasn't. It was humiliating." My chest tightened painfully. "I know." "No, you don't." Tears filled his eyes suddenly. "You didn't hear what people said about us." I stared at him in disbelief. "Michael? I lived it too. But you were okay with it." That hurt more than everything else combined, because he still didn't understand. "I was never okay with struggling," I whispered. "I was okay with surviving together." The tears finally spilled down his face then. Angry tears. Broken tears. The kind men like Michael spend years learning how to hide. "You know what it felt like watching rich kids laugh at Dad's truck," he said hoarsely, "or hearing people make jokes about your accent." I closed my eyes briefly, because, yes, I remembered all of it, every cruel comment, every humiliation, every closed door. But I also remembered something Michael had forgotten. Love. "We were never poor in the ways that mattered most," I whispered. Michael laughed bitterly through tears. That sounds nice when you're the one without ambition. The room went still. Even he seemed to realize too late how cruel those words were. Emma looked horrified. Dad. I lowered my eyes slowly. And strangely, that sentence hurt even more than the restaurant humiliation earlier, because this one came from deep inside him. Harold quietly closed the folder again. I think tonight has made one thing very clear. Michael wiped his face aggressively. And what's that? Harold looked directly at him. Your father feared money would turn success into entitlement. Silence, then softly. And he may have been right. Michael looked at me then. Really looked at me. For the first time all night, I think he finally saw the damage in my eyes. Not anger, not revenge, heartbreak. And somehow, that seemed to frighten him more than losing the company ever could. After Harold's final words, nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt raw now, exhausted, like the room itself had grown tired of carrying so much disappointment. Michael stood motionless near the table, his face pale, his eyes red from anger and humiliation. For the first time all night, he no longer looked powerful. He looked lost. Richard Coleman slowly gathered his papers and stood. I think we should pause all discussions regarding the expansion deal until the situation is reviewed properly. Michael immediately looked up. Richard, this is bigger than a family disagreement now? His tone was professional again. Cold. Corporate. The kind of voice investors use when emotion becomes inconvenient. One by one, the other investors stood as well. No one shouted. No one insulted Michael. But somehow their quiet distance felt even worse, because rejection delivered politely still cuts deeply. Richard looked toward me before leaving. For what it's worth, Mrs. Martinez. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. I nodded softly. Thank you. Then he turned toward Michael. You should go home. Not call me tomorrow. Not we'll figure this out. Just go home. Michael watched helplessly as the investors walked out of the executive room one after another. Years of networking. Years of image building. Years of carefully constructing his reputation. And tonight, everything had started slipping through his fingers. Vanessa remained near the door, with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She looked emotionally drained. You lied to me too, she said quietly. Michael rubbed his forehead. Vanessa, please. No. Tears filled her eyes now. You made me believe your mother was financially irresponsible. I lowered my gaze immediately, because hearing those things spoken aloud still hurt. Vanessa shook her head slowly. She came into this restaurant wearing repaired shoes while sitting on enough wealth to buy half the building. I didn't know. Michael snapped. But you liked believing she was beneath you. The truth of that sentence landed hard. Michael didn't answer, because he couldn't. Emma finally stood and walked toward her father carefully. Dad. Michael looked at his daughter, and for one brief second, his entire expression softened. Hey, sweetheart. But Emma's eyes were full of tears. Why were you so mean to Grandma? The question was simple, pure, childlike, and somehow more devastating than everything Harold or the investors had said all night. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there is no elegant explanation for cruelty, especially to a child. Emma's voice trembled. She loves you. That finally broke something in him. Michael sat down heavily in the nearest chair and covered his face with both hands. The room fell silent again. I stared at my son, quietly remembering all the times I held him while he cried as a child. After nightmares. After bullying at school. After Carlos died. Back then, He always let himself be comforted. Somewhere along the way, he stopped believing love could exist without weakness attached to it. And that may have been the greatest tragedy of all. Harold stood slowly. "I'll give you both a moment." Sophia nodded and followed him toward the door. Vanessa hesitated before leaving too, though not before quietly taking Emma's hand. "You can stay," Emma whispered to me, but I smiled gently. "It's all right." Reluctantly, she followed her mother out. Then suddenly, it was just me and Michael alone inside the executive room. Mother and son. Nothing else left to hide behind. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Michael finally lowered his hands from his face. His eyes looked exhausted now. Older somehow. "You should have told me." I almost laughed at the irony. "Told you what, that we weren't..." He struggled with the words. "That we weren't still those people." I stared at him quietly. What people? The poor family everyone pitied. My chest tightened painfully. "Michael, we were never pitiful." "Yes, we were." The bitterness in his voice startled me. He stood abruptly and began pacing again. "You know what it felt like growing up watching other kids get everything so easily," he demanded. "Nice houses? Vacations? New clothes? I know what it felt like trying to give you those things." He stopped walking. For a second, emotion flickered across his face again. Then pride returned. "You don't understand." "No," I whispered sadly. "I understand too well." He shook his head. "You made poverty sound honorable. I made survival honorable. That's not the same thing." I looked at him for a long moment, then quietly asked the question that had been sitting in my heart for years. "When did you start being ashamed of me?" Michael froze. Real fear entered his eyes then, because suddenly this wasn't about business anymore. It was personal, painfully personal. "I wasn't ashamed of you," he said weakly. "Yes, you were." He looked away, and that silence became his confession. Tears filled my eyes again, despite my efforts to stop them. "I spent years thinking maybe I talked too much. Maybe I dressed wrong. Maybe I embarrassed you somehow without realizing it. Mom, but tonight..." My voice cracked. "Tonight you looked at me like I was something dirty." The pain on his face deepened. Good. Maybe he finally felt some of what I had carried for years. "I didn't mean it like that." "Then how did you mean it?" He had no answer. Because cruelty rarely survives honest examination. Michael slowly sat down again, looking suddenly smaller than I had ever seen him. He swallowed hard. "I worked so hard to build a different life, and I was proud of you. I didn't want people seeing where I came from. There it was, finally, the truth. Not polished, not corporate, just ugly and honest." I closed my eyes briefly. "When your father was dying, I whispered his greatest fear wasn't poverty." Michael looked up slowly. "It was losing you." The room became painfully quiet. "He worried success would harden your heart." Michael's jaw tightened. "You think I'm heartless?" "No." I looked at him sadly. "I think you became afraid of love that didn't improve your image." That sentence hit him hard. I saw it, because deep down, he knew it was true. All those years distancing himself from me. He called it ambition, but really it was fear. Fear of becoming the boy from the poor neighborhood again. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being ordinary. Michael suddenly looked exhausted beyond words. "What happens now?" The question sounded almost childlike. I stared at my son quietly, and despite everything, Despite the humiliation, despite the cruelty, part of me still wanted to protect him. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Love does not disappear simply because someone hurts you. Sometimes it hurts even more because it remains. I don't know, I answered honestly. Michael looked down at the table. Then softly, so softly I almost missed it, he whispered, I didn't think tonight would end like this. Neither did I. Because when I left San Antonio that morning, I thought my son had invited me to dinner. I never imagined I was actually attending the funeral of the relationship we used to have. By the time Michael and I walked out of the executive room, the restaurant no longer felt glamorous. It felt exposed, like all the polished luxury had peeled away, revealing something cold underneath. The investors were gone. Most of the guests had returned to their dinners, though I could still feel curious eyes following us across the room. Wealthy people pretend not to stare, but they always do when power shifts publicly. Michael walked beside me in silence, not the confident silence he usually carried. This silence was heavy, humiliated, defeated. Vanessa stood near the entrance, holding Emma's hand. Her makeup remained flawless, but her eyes were swollen from crying. I never thought I would see Vanessa Martinez look uncertain about anything. The moment she saw Michael, she straightened. What did Harold say? Michael didn't answer immediately. Because how do you summarize the collapse of your identity in one sentence? Finally, he muttered, the board's reviewing everything. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. And the investors? He looked away. That was answer enough. Emma quietly moved toward me again. Grandma, are you leaving? I touched her hair gently. Soon. Can I come visit you this weekend? Before I could answer, Vanessa surprised all of us. Yes, she said softly. I think that would be good. Michael looked up sharply. Vanessa ignored him. Then she looked directly at me. I owe you an apology. The words clearly hurt her pride to say. But unlike Michael, she said them anyway. I judged you, she continued quietly, and I believed things I shouldn't have. I saw genuine regret in her face. Not perfect regret, not complete understanding, but real enough. I nodded softly. Thank you. Michael suddenly exhaled sharply. So now everyone's against me. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. That's what you got from tonight. He ran both hands through his hair again, pacing near the front entrance now. My entire company is falling apart, and your mother, Vanessa, snapped. Did you think about her for even 1 second tonight? Michael looked exhausted. I said things I shouldn't have. You humiliated her publicly. She humiliated me too. The second those words left his mouth, Emma burst into tears. Stop it, she cried. The entire lobby area went silent. Emma looked at her father with heartbreak written all over her young face. She's your mom. That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Michael looked stunned. Not because Emma was wrong, because children have a brutal way of stripping adults down to truth. Vanessa immediately wrapped an arm around Emma protectively. Come on, sweetheart. But Emma shook her head stubbornly. No. Her eyes remained fixed on Michael. You made Grandma cry. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no defense left. Not anymore. I suddenly realized something painful in that moment. This night would live inside Emma forever. Long after the business meetings ended, long after the financial consequences settled. Children remember moments where love fails publicly. And tonight, Michael failed spectacularly. Harold approached quietly from behind us, carrying the leather folder under his arm. Cars waiting outside Evelyn. I nodded. Part of me desperately wanted to go home, to leave Dallas, to crawl back into my quiet little house where nothing glamorous ever happened, and nobody looked at me with disappointment. But another part of me couldn't stop staring at my son, because despite everything, he still looked broken. Sophia stepped forward next. Michael. He looked up tiredly. The board will meet Monday morning. His face tightened immediately. That fast, yes. Michael laughed bitterly under his breath. Of course. Sophia's voice softened slightly. I tried delaying it. That surprised him. It surprised me too. Michael looked confused. Why? Because despite tonight? She hesitated carefully. I remember who you used to be. Something in his expression cracked again, and suddenly I realized something important. I wasn't the only person grieving who Michael had become. Everyone who knew him before success probably was. Michael leaned heavily against the wall near the entrance. I can fix this. But nobody answered, because deep down, we all understood the truth. This wasn't just about numbers anymore, or investors, or expense reports. It was about character, trust, love, and those things don't recover as quickly as stock values. Vanessa finally spoke again, quieter this time. You know what the worst part is? Michael looked at her. You actually made me believe you were ashamed of being poor. His jaw tightened. I was. No. Tears filled her eyes again. You became ashamed of the people who loved you before you had money. The truth of that sentence seemed to physically wound him. Good. Maybe pain was finally reaching places pride had protected too long. Emma slowly let go of Vanessa's hand and walked toward Michael carefully. For a moment, he looked hopeful, like maybe she was coming to comfort him. Instead, she asked softly, if Grandma was poor, would you still have talked to her like that tonight? Michael froze completely. No one moved. No one even breathed. Because children sometimes ask the exact question adults spend years avoiding. Michael stared at his daughter helplessly, and once again, he had no answer. Emma's eyes filled with tears again. That's what scares me. Then she quietly walked back toward me. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders automatically. Michael looked devastated now. Truly devastated. But not because of the company. Not because of the investors. Because for the first time all night, he finally saw himself through someone else's eyes. And he didn't like what he saw. Outside the restaurant windows, rain had started falling over downtown Dallas. The city lights blurred softly against the wet glass. Everything suddenly felt colder. Harold checked his watch quietly. We should go. I nodded slowly, but before leaving, I turned toward Michael one last time. My son looked exhausted beyond words. Tie loosened, eyes red, pride shattered open. And suddenly, I remembered him at 12 years old after losing his first baseball championship. He cried in the car all the way home because he thought disappointing people meant they stopped loving you. I told him something that night. Something I wasn't sure he even remembered anymore. Failure does not make you unlovable. Cruelty does. I looked at him quietly now, and for the first time since arriving in Dallas, Michael truly looked afraid, not of losing money, of losing us. Mom, his voice cracked badly. I stopped walking. The word alone nearly destroyed me, because no matter how old he became, he still sounded like my little boy when he was hurting. I never wanted this, he whispered. I believed him. That was the tragedy. People rarely intend to become cruel. They simply make small, selfish choices for so long that eventually cruelty feels normal. Tears burned behind my eyes again. I know. Michael swallowed hard. Please, don't take everything away from me. The room fell silent one final time, and deep down, I realized the next choice I made would decide whether this family still had any future left at all. Please don't take everything away from me. Michael's voice barely sounded like his own anymore. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the arrogance. What remained was fear. Raw, desperate fear. Rain continued falling outside the restaurant windows, while the city lights shimmered across the wet streets below. Around us, the staff pretended not to listen, though I knew every person nearby could feel the tension hanging in the air. I stared at my son quietly. For years, I imagined this moment differently. I imagined confronting him someday, demanding answers, making him finally understand how deeply his distance had hurt me. But now that the moment was here, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, heartbroken, and older than I had ever felt before. Harold stepped beside me carefully. Evelyn, he said softly, you don't need to decide tonight. But the truth was, I already had. Maybe not completely, but enough. I looked at Michael. You think I want revenge? His eyes dropped immediately. No, but you think I want punishment. He swallowed hard without answering. That silence was enough. I took a slow breath. When your father created the trust protections, he wasn't trying to control you. Michael looked up. He was trying to protect you from becoming someone who measured human value by status. Pain flickered across his face again, because even he knew that's exactly what had happened. Vanessa remained near the entrance, holding Emma close while silently watching us. For the first time since I met her, Vanessa looked stripped of performance too. No perfect social mask, no polished superiority, just exhaustion, and maybe regret. Michael rubbed his eyes with both hands. So what happens now? I glanced toward Harold briefly, then back at my son. You're stepping down from executive control temporarily. His head snapped upward instantly. What the board review will happen Monday? I continued quietly. You will cooperate fully. Panic flashed across his face again. You're removing me temporarily. That company is my life. No, I said softly. It became your identity? That's different. The words hit him hard. He shook his head slowly. You can't just take everything I built. I'm not taking it. My voice finally hardened slightly. You nearly destroyed it yourself. Silence. Because deep down, he knew I was right. Richard's investors leaving tonight would spread quickly. Questions about company finances would spread faster. And the story behind tonight, that would spread fastest of all. Not because people care about morality, because wealthy people love scandal. Michael paced again, anger rising beneath his panic. This is unbelievable. No, Vanessa said quietly. What's unbelievable is that your mother still hasn't walked away from you completely. Michael looked at her sharply. You're taking her side now? I'm taking the side that still has basic decency. The exhaustion in her voice sounded genuine now. She looked toward me briefly. I spent years thinking Evelyn judged me. I blinked in surprise. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You were always so quiet around me. I thought you disliked me? I never disliked you. She lowered her eyes. But I let Michael convince me you were beneath us. The shame in her face made my heart ache unexpectedly. Because arrogance is contagious. People catch it from each other, especially in wealthy circles where status becomes more important than character. Emma suddenly stepped away from Vanessa and walked toward Michael again. This time, her voice sounded small. Dad Michael looked at her immediately. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you still rich?" The question would have sounded funny under different circumstances. Tonight it felt devastating. Michael stared at his daughter for several seconds before answering. "I don't know." Emma frowned slightly. Then she asked the question none of us were prepared for. "If you lost all your money, would Grandma still love you?" Tears instantly filled my eyes. Michael looked completely shattered. Because finally, someone had forced him to confront the difference between wealth and love. And the person who did it was his own child. "Yes," he whispered hoarsely. Emma nodded slowly. "Then why wasn't that enough for you?" No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. Because children sometimes solve emotional truths adults spend decades complicating. Michael slowly sat down in one of the lobby chairs and stared at the floor. "I don't even know how I became this person." The honesty in his voice startled me. Harold quietly crossed his arms. Happened slowly. Michael looked up at him. "You knew." Harold nodded once. "I suspected." "And nobody said anything." Harold's expression softened sadly. "People tried. You stopped listening." That was true. I remembered every phone call Michael rushed through. Every holiday dinner cut short because of business. Every time he subtly corrected my clothes, my accent, my stories. None of it happened overnight. Cruelty rarely does. It grows quietly through entitlement. Michael suddenly looked toward me again. "What if I change?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke me. Because for the first time all night, he sounded sincere, not defensive, not manipulative, afraid. I walked slowly toward him. My son looked up at me with tears in his eyes, and suddenly, I saw every version of him all at once. The little boy, the grieving teenager, the ambitious young man, the arrogant executive, all tangled together inside one broken person. I touched his face gently the same way I used to when he was small. "You can change," I whispered. His eyes closed briefly. "But not while people keep rescuing you from consequences." A tear slipped down his cheek. "I'm scared." There it was, the truth underneath all the ego. Fear. Fear of becoming powerless again. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of losing love if success disappeared. I stroked his hair softly. "So is your father." Michael looked shocked. "What, every day?" I smiled sadly through my tears. He was terrified he wouldn't provide enough. Terrified you'd struggle. Terrified I deserved more. Michael stared at me silently. "But do you know what made your father different?" He shook his head slightly. He never treated people like they were worthless just because they had less. The tears kept falling down his face now. Not angry tears anymore. Mourning tears. The kind people cry when they realize they've become someone they don't recognize. I stepped back slowly. "You're losing your position for now." Michael nodded weakly. "You'll cooperate with the investigation." Another nod. "You'll rebuild trust honestly." This time, his voice cracked. "How?" I looked at him for a long moment. One humble choice at a time. The rain outside had finally started slowing. The storm passing. Maybe that meant something. Or maybe I simply wanted it to. Harold checked his watch quietly again. "We should leave." I nodded. This time, when I turned toward the door, Michael didn't stop me. He didn't argue, didn't yell. He just sat there looking emotionally exhausted while his entire life rearranged itself around him. And somehow, that frightened me more than his anger ever had. Because broken pride can become dangerous, but broken identity that can either destroy a person or finally remake them into someone better. I just didn't know yet which path my son would choose. 3 weeks passed before I saw my son again. 3 quiet, painful weeks. The board suspended Michael from executive operations pending financial review. News spread quickly through business circles, though the company carefully avoided public scandal. Investors pulled back temporarily. Articles began appearing online using phrases like internal restructuring and leadership concerns. Michael disappeared from social events almost overnight. Funny how quickly wealthy people stop calling once someone's status becomes uncertain. But none of that hurt me the way the silence did. For the first few days after Dallas, I barely slept. I kept replaying the dinner in my head over and over again. The shame in Michael's eyes, the cruelty in his voice. The moment he asked them to move me near the kitchen, some wounds echo long after the words themselves end. Still, every morning, I woke up and continued my routine. Coffee in Carlos's old mug, watering the garden, volunteering at church. Life has a strange way of continuing even after your heart cracks open. Emma called me almost every evening. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes she just wanted me to stay on the phone while she did homework because, as she put it, your voice makes things feel calmer. I think she needed stability after everything that happened. Honestly, so did I. Vanessa called once too. That surprised me. I left Michael, she said quietly the moment I answered. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. What happened? A long silence followed. Then I don't know who he is anymore. There was real grief in her voice. Not dramatic grief, exhausted grief. The kind people feel when illusions finally collapse. He's trying, she added softly. But I don't know if he even understands himself yet. I didn't know either. That was the frightening part. Sometimes people apologize because they fear consequences. Sometimes they apologize because they genuinely change. And sometimes even they don't know the difference yet. Then one Thursday evening, just after sunset, someone knocked softly on my front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Mothers always know. Michael stood on the porch wearing jeans, work boots, and a plain dark sweatshirt. No expensive watch, no luxury car behind him. Just an old pickup truck parked along the curb beneath the streetlight. For a moment, he looked almost like Carlos. That nearly broke me immediately. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not weak, humbled. I stepped aside quietly. "Come in." Michael entered slowly, looking around the tiny living room like he hadn't truly seen it in years. The faded couch, the old family photographs. Carlos's recliner still sitting untouched near the window. Everything looked exactly the same, but somehow we didn't. "I forgot this place smells like cinnamon," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "I baked earlier?" He nodded awkwardly. Then silence settled between us. Uncomfortable. Heavy. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee, please." As I prepared 2 cups, Michael remained unusually quiet behind me. I noticed his hands carefully. Rough. Red around the knuckles. Not soft like before. "You working?" I asked gently. He nodded. "At one of the hotel properties." I turned slightly. "What kind of work?" Another pause. "Maintenance." That surprised me. Michael noticed. "The board said if I wanted any chance of rebuilding trust, I needed to understand the company from the ground up again." Something in my chest shifted painfully, because for the first time in years, he sounded less like an executive and more like the hardworking boy Carlos raised. I handed him the coffee carefully. He held the warm mug in both hands for several seconds without drinking. Finally, he spoke. I hated being poor. The honesty in his voice filled the kitchen quietly. I sat across from him. I know. No, he whispered. I mean, I really hated it. His eyes stayed fixed on the coffee. I hated hearing kids laugh at Dad's truck. I remained silent. I hated pretending not to notice when other families had more food than we did. My throat tightened. I hated watching you come home exhausted every night, pretending you weren't tired. Tears filled my eyes immediately, because I never realized how much he noticed. Michael swallowed hard. I think somewhere along the way. He paused shakily. I started believing success meant becoming completely different from who we were. I watched my son carefully. This felt different tonight. No defensiveness, no performance, just truth. And when people reminded me where I came from, he continued quietly, I panicked. I thought back to the restaurant, the investors, the embarrassment, the shame. Not excuses, explanations. There's a difference. Michael looked up at me finally. But none of that excuses what I did to you. The tears in his eyes looked real, raw, unprotected. And suddenly, I remembered him at age 15, apologizing after wrecking Carlos's truck by accident. He cried harder over disappointing us than damaging the vehicle itself. That boy still existed somewhere inside him after all. I was cruel, he whispered. I looked down at my coffee. Yes, the truth hurt both of us. Michael nodded slowly. You know what the worst part is. What I saw your face after I said it. His voice cracked badly, and I still kept going. That sentence shattered me more than anything else, because it meant he finally understood the true damage. Not the investors, not the business fallout. Me. I don't know how to forgive myself for that, he admitted. I stared at my son quietly for a long time, then softly asked, Why did you come tonight? He answered immediately. Because losing the company scared me. The honesty startled me, but losing you scared me more. Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, crickets hummed softly beneath the warm Texas night. Michael wiped his eyes roughly. I kept hearing Emma ask me if you'd still love me without money. I smiled sadly, and he laughed weakly through tears. And I realized you already proved that your entire life. That nearly made me cry again. Michael leaned forward slowly. I spent years trying to become someone important. You are important. He shook his head. No, I became impressive. That's different. The wisdom in that sentence sounded painfully earned. For several seconds, we simply sat together quietly. Not fixed, not healed, but honest. Finally, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A folded photograph. He slid it across the table toward me. I opened it carefully. It was an old picture of Carlos and me standing beside Michael after his college graduation. All three of us smiling, young, hopeful, whole. I found it in my office drawer yesterday, Michael whispered, and I realized something. I looked up at him. My entire life. Tears filled his eyes again. I kept trying to become successful enough to stop feeling ashamed. He paused. But Dad never looked ashamed once. No, Carlos never did. Even during our hardest years, he carried dignity like something nobody could steal. I reached across the table slowly and took my son's trembling hand. I don't know if trust heals completely overnight, I whispered honestly. Michael nodded. I know, but I believe people can change when they finally tell themselves the truth. He closed his eyes briefly as tears slipped down his face. Then quietly, for the first time in years, my son cried in front of me without hiding it. And this time, I held him the same way I did when he was little. Not because he deserved immediate forgiveness, but because healing has to begin somewhere. 6 months later, my dining room table was full again. Not with investors, not with wealthy strangers pretending to admire one another. With family. Real family. The kind that sits too close together, passes food twice, interrupts stories halfway through, and laughs louder than necessary. The kind we almost lost. I stood in my kitchen finishing the last tray of enchiladas while the sound of Emma laughing drifted through the house. Warm evening sunlight poured through the curtains Carlos picked out years ago, turning the entire room gold. For the first time in a very long while, my home felt alive again. Grandma Emma called from the living room. Dad burned the garlic bread. I did not burn it, Michael argued immediately. You absolutely burned it. I smiled to myself. Somehow, hearing them bicker felt healing. When I carried the food into the dining room, Michael immediately stood to help me. Not because guests were watching, not because appearances mattered, simply because he noticed I was carrying too much. That difference meant everything. Careful, he said softly, taking the heavier tray from my hands. Our eyes met briefly. There was still sadness there sometimes. Still regret. Those things don't disappear overnight. But there was humility now too. And humility changes people. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later carrying dessert from the bakery down the street. Things between her and Michael remained complicated. They had started counseling together slowly, trying to rebuild trust. Not perfectly, honestly, which mattered more. Smells amazing in here, she said as she stepped inside. You always say that before eating 3 servings, Emma teased. Vanessa laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in months. I learned from your grandmother. I rolled my eyes playfully. Don't drag me into your bad habits. The warmth in the room still surprised me sometimes. Because only half a year earlier, I truly believed our family had shattered beyond repair. But pain changes shape when people finally stop lying to themselves. Michael spent those 6 months working at the hotel properties under strict board supervision. Maintenance shifts, front desk training, cleaning crews, vendor coordination. No executive office, no luxury privileges, no special treatment. At first, he hated it. I could see the frustration in him every time we spoke on the phone. But gradually, something shifted. One evening, he called me after helping fix plumbing issues in one of the employee housing buildings. You know something weird? He asked. What I never learned most of these workers' names before. That sentence stayed with me for days, because entitlement blinds people slowly. It teaches them to see service instead of humanity. But humility restores vision. The board eventually allowed Michael limited operational involvement again, not because I demanded it, but because several department managers quietly reported that he had changed. He listens now, Sophia told me one afternoon over coffee. The surprise in her voice made me laugh softly. He used to walk through properties like he was inspecting machines. Now he actually talks to people. I thought about that often. Sometimes growth doesn't appear dramatically. Sometimes it appears in smaller things. Patience, listening, kindness toward people who cannot benefit you. Those are the real signs. Tonight, as everyone gathered around my old dining table, I watched Michael carefully from across the room. He looked different now. Not poorer, lighter, less obsessed with proving himself. Emma sat beside him happily explaining school gossip, while Vanessa helped set the table. Every few minutes, Michael glanced toward me quietly, almost like he still feared this peace might disappear if he stopped appreciating it long enough. Maybe that fear was healthy. Some lessons should stay with us forever. Okay, Emma announced dramatically. Family rule tonight. Nobody talks about business. Agreed, Vanessa said immediately. Michael lifted both hands in surrender. Trust me, I'm happy not talking about business. We all laughed softly. Then for a moment, silence settled around the table. Not uncomfortable silence. Comfortable silence. The kind families earn after surviving difficult things together. Michael looked around the room slowly, at the old photographs on the walls, at Carlos's recliner near the window, at me. I used to hate this house, he admitted quietly. The honesty surprised none of us now, but he continued before anyone could react. Not because of the house itself. His eyes lowered, because I associated it with feeling small. I listened carefully. Michael took a slow breath. But now, he looked around again. I think this was the richest place I ever lived. Tears instantly filled my eyes, not because the sentence sounded dramatic, because he finally understood. Money creates comfort, but love creates worth, and those things are not the same. Vanessa reached for his hand quietly beneath the table. Emma smiled at both of them. And suddenly, I felt Carlos everywhere in that room, in the laughter, in the repaired relationships, in the second chance our family somehow found after nearly destroying itself. Michael looked toward me again. I still think about that night sometimes. The room grew quieter. I knew exactly which night he meant. The restaurant, the humiliation, the words neither of us would ever completely forget. So do I admitted softly. Pain crossed his face immediately. I wish I could take it back. I nodded slowly. I know, but maybe. He swallowed hard. Maybe if it never happened, I would have kept becoming worse. That truth settled heavily over the table. Because sometimes collapse becomes the beginning of healing. Emma frowned slightly. I still can't believe you said Grandma was too poor to sit somewhere. Michael closed his eyes briefly in embarrassment. Believe me, he muttered, I can't either. Then he looked directly at me. You know what the craziest part is. What I thought money made people important. His voice cracked slightly. But the person everyone respected most in the end was you. I smiled sadly. No, sweetheart? He frowned. No, I shook my head gently. The most important thing wasn't respect. The room quieted again. It was remembering we belonged to each other before we belonged to anything else. Michael stared at me silently for several seconds, then slowly nodded. And for the first time in many years, I saw peace in my son's eyes instead of hunger. Not hunger for success, not hunger for approval. Just peace. Outside, the Texas sky darkened into evening, while laughter slowly returned to the room around us. No crystal chandeliers, no investors, no luxury restaurant, just an old dining table filled with people finally learning how to love each other honestly again. And somehow, that felt richer than anything money could ever buy. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Stories like these remind us how easy it is to lose sight of what truly matters until life forces us to stop and look again. And now, I'd really love to hear from you. Do you think Evelyn was right to forgive Michael? Could you forgive someone who publicly humiliated you like that? Share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It always amazes me how stories can connect people from all around the world.